Hey, all right. Ready, set, engage, episode 16. My foot didn't fit there, so I guess I'm not putting my foot there. Ready, set, engage, episode 16. This one, once again, the views expressed here represent mine and mine alone and do not reflect that of my employer or any organization that I'm affiliated with. And I think that's an important thing to call out because I'm going to go possibly a little far out today. So there's two core premises that I want to discuss in this episode. The first is the Bill of Rights, and so I want to talk about this as the Bill of Rights is a construct that exists in concentric rings. And the premise behind that is basically you start with the core of how to ensure freedom, and then you build out to what necessarily entails freedom at the fringes, okay? And then the second one is this conversation related to political parties, specifically the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I realized I can't talk about right and left because I had a conversation with somebody who aligned it as right and left, and then it was very hard to pin down like actuality of cause. Like we talked about Obamacare, and their supposition was that Obamacare was a right-wing sort of agenda, which blew my mind. And so two parts: Bill of Rights, concentric rings of freedom, and the second part is Democratic and Republican Party. Craig, I can't wait. Like, I think most people watch on demand later, so it's hard to wait for people to show up and be like, hey. So Bill of Rights as concentric rings. This idea of Bill of Rights as concentric rings, I think was proposed by somebody else, and so I'm just going to steal it. But basically, when you start at the top of the Bill of Rights for the American Constitution, Craig, I realize you're Canadian, so bear with me. The core premise is sort of that individual rights are the most important, and then after you get rid of individual rights, then you can move into additional rights and freedoms that should be regarded to everybody, okay? And so the idea of the Bill of Rights isn't necessarily that they should cover all scenarios. Instead, it should be the core premises of freedom and sort of Republican democracy for the United States. And so the first one is the, I'll read it to you. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government to a redress of grievances. And so basically what this means is you have the ability to speak up for what you believe in. What you believe in is yours to have, keep, and express, right? And where you express that is sort of independent or orthogonal. It's outside the realm of this right. Basically, this right is you can believe what you want to believe. You can have the language, understanding, and capitulation, or you can represent your beliefs in whatever way you want to represent them. That is your right, okay? And that's sort of this core basis from which all other rights have to ascend, right? If you can't represent yourself freely, then what else does anything else matter, right? And so we'll get into the concentric rings, but the core premise is you have to be an individual and be able to represent yourself as an individual. Otherwise, nothing else really fucking matters, okay? Second Amendment and why it's a concentric ring. First Amendment is your ability to own and represent your right. Your Second Amendment is your ability and capability to represent and guard that right against government, tyranny, or anything else. And so it's a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. Basically, this means that, hey, you've got this right to freedom of speech, and in order for that to like not be mistakable that that's your right to keep, you have to be able to defend that right. And so to defend that right, you get guns, right? You have to be able to form a well-regulated militia. You have to be able to defend yourself against a military power, whether that's tyrannical here or some other country representing that upon us. Okay, so your first right, speak, have thought, generate thought, and own it. Second right, defend that, right? The Third Amendment, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house, without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. And basically what this means, what quartering a soldier is to actually like give them quarter, to house a soldier in your house. And so if you look back in the old days, basically the soldiers would come take over your house, impel you to cook for them, prepare for them, take after them, etc. They would basically rule your house, right? And you had to follow along, or they would simply kill you. And so the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights is simply that, hey, that shit's unjust. And so if it's your house, it's your house. You don't have to have soldiers come in and tell you how to live, whether it's in peacetime or wartime. Like it's completely unjust. Fourth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land of naval forces or in the military in actual service in time of war or public dangers, nor shall any person subject to the same offense be put twice, to be twice put in jeopardy, double jeopardy law, or of life or limb, nor be compelled to any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any property be taken for public use without just compensation. Basically, the Fourth Amendment right is just saying, hey, due process. Like, if you go up and you get acquitted of murder like OJ, then, hey, if you got acquitted, you're good. If you didn't get acquitted, then there's later stuff that says you can appeal that. I don't know how many times. It's ridiculous. But basically the Fourth Amendment right is now you've been accused of a criminal case. So it's no longer individual rights that extend to everybody. It's now rights that extend to criminals or those accused of criminal acts, right? And so we started with the First Amendment right. Speech is good for everyone, bar none, just everybody. Second Amendment, your ability to protect your freedom of speech, belief, religion, etc., good for everyone across the board, right? And it preserves that First Amendment right. Your Third Amendment right, which was the, I got to rewind for a second. Third Amendment right was quartering of soldiers. Nobody should be able to come into your house and like take over and that be legal. And so like you own your house, whether it's soldier, wartime, or peace, that doesn't matter. You own your house. Fourth Amendment right, no double jeopardy. So now you've been accused of a crime, right? So it's not everybody. It's those accused of a crime. Fifth Amendment, it's the right not to incriminate yourself. And so basically, I can read the whole thing. In criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime has been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to the informed of the nature and cause of accusation. Hey, John. To be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have a compulsory process of obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Basically, you have the right to an attorney. These are a lot of the Miranda rights. You have the right not to incriminate yourself, so just shut the fuck up. You have the right to hear the opposing witnesses against you. So if there's character assassination, you have a right to defend yourself. So the Fifth Amendment right is not only you've been accused of a crime, but you're now at trial for the crime, and you're now within that thing. And so, again, we're sort of narrowing that band of possibilities, and then we'll broaden it back up for the 9th and 10th. Sixth Amendment, criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state or district which in the crime has been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, blah, blah, blah. Basically, this means like, hey, it starts with the local jurisdiction, and then if you need to assume another jurisdiction because of impartiality or bias or partiality, then you're welcome to do that. John, Second Amendment, absolutely you do. And this is the concentric rings that they build out. Sixth Amendment, yep. So basically like speedy and public trial, you can waive this right. So if you ever wind up being on the wrong side of the law, you get a thing that says, hey, I would like to waive, assuming you you hold an attorney, you get the ability to waive your Sixth Amendment right that says, hey, you don't have to do a speedy trial. We can just wait until I figure out what the hell I'm going to say. Not that I know from experience, I'm telling for a friend. Seventh Amendment, in suits at common law where the value of a controversy shall exceed $20. Woo! The right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Basically, like, one, $20 was a ton of money back then. But two, like, if you figure out that trial in a civil litigation court, like, that's the answer. You can't keep fucking retrying and appealing to exponential levels of appellate courts and superior court and etc. Like, if it's common law and you fuck somebody out of $20, you have to go with whatever the court says with or goes with. Eighth Amendment, excessive bail should not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel or unusual punishment. So basically, First Amendment, you can believe what the hell you want to believe and say what the hell you want to say. You can associate with the people that you want to associate with. That's your fundamental right. The biggest cornerstone right of this entire fucking thing. Second Amendment right, you have the right to protect that First Amendment right to identify in any way that you want to identify. Those are core premises, right? Third Amendment, we extend it out just a little bit. We kind of say, hey, if you own something, you own it. Soldiers can't come in and take over whether or not it's peacetime or wartime. Fourth Amendment is the double jeopardy rule. Like, basically, if you get tried and you get acquitted, you don't have to keep fucking coming back unless it's civil court and your name is OJ. Fifth Amendment, you don't have to incriminate yourself. And so, like, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, you're all basically like accused of a crime. And so it's not the entire population, but it's these rights that we have to preserve for everyone, such that we can't have tyranny that does a scarlet letter, says, hey, you're guilty, and all of a sudden you're fucking put to death, right? So your fourth through eighth Amendment rights are basically things that are good for everybody, such that we don't wind up with people getting lynched or guillotined or fucking killed for no goddamn reason because somebody accused you of something. So the idea is you start with the core tenet of the First Amendment, you build concentric circles out from that. Ninth and 10th are interesting. The ninth is the enumeration of the Constitution. In the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And this is important because basically it says, like, your right to exist and your right to own your world, your immediate world and circumstance is kind of more important than what's in the Constitution. And so the Ninth Amendment winds up coming up in Roe versus Wade and a number of other sort of controversial, not only abortion, but that realm of philosophy, right? Basically, like, the state shouldn't tell you how to live your individualized life. And then the 10th, which may be the most important, especially for the conversation we're about to get into, is the 10th is the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states respectively, or to the people. This is really fucking important, especially when we start talking about political parties. So if I were to take and extrapolate that out or paint that into a thing, basically what it means, or how you can interpret it, is the federal government shouldn't take accountability, rights, privilege, or the ability to dictate the particulars of your life at the federal level if it's better kept at a local, state, county, provincial, or city level. So basically, like, don't do shit at the federal government if it's not right for everybody. Do shit at the lowest level of the government that applies to the entirety of the populace, such that the federal government isn't by in a way sort of dictatorial or tyrannical. And I think that that's probably the most important to me. And so that's the Bill of Rights. Starts with the hey, here's your core premise of your ability to think, believe, represent whatever you believe. Your Second Amendment right, you get to protect that First Amendment right. Like, that's core to having the First Amendment right, is your ability to protect it. Third Amendment right, like, hey, even the fucking government can't come in and say that you lose your rights as a homeowner, you lose your rights as a home and a family because of war, government, or military. Like, they don't have that right to come in and exact themselves on you. The 4th through 8th are basically like, hey, if you're accused of a crime, you get a lot of rights that just basically say, like, it can't be unjust. It has to be by a jury of your peers. You can't they can't keep charging you the same fucking crime all the time, unless you do the same crime multiple times. That's different. Craig, there's a number of things, but the Bill of Rights, like basically, I had a conversation, somebody at work, really nice guy. He's from the Netherlands, and so I expressed the idea that I believe that the Bill of Rights is a concentric ring of things where it starts from the absolute most important and then builds down. And he was like, really, is that justified or validated? And I'm like, yeah, it is. And then I didn't have a single source that I was able to say, yeah, or look right here, and it says like it builds. And so here I'm describing why I believe it builds. And then the second part related to Democratic and Republican Party was really related to me trying to, Netherlands is a fucking fascinating place. Like really, if we want to talk about natural disasters, and we want to talk about flood mitigation, we want to talk about the stuff that went on in New Orleans and things like that. Like you should really look into the Netherlands, because their capital is like 30 feet under the fucking sea level, right? And we can't even do with 30 feet over the sea level, because our dikes are not meant for 100-year floodplain or whatever the shit. And so like, yeah, Netherlands like is impressive. I digress. So why I wanted to talk about the Democratic, it could be tomorrow's topic. If I get like 1 or 2 or 3 topics, then maybe that'll be tomorrow's topic. What I wanted to talk about political parties is basically there's a very smart individual at work. I won't give away his name, and then we'll see if he comments here. We have conversations all the time, because we're not disparate ends. Like if you build a continuum of political beliefs, I'm moderate, or I'm almost centrist, fiscally conservative, but mostly centrist, and he's probably way further left than definitely than me. And so we have these very interesting conversations. We came about this philosophical conversation of whether or not the right or the left winds up being authoritarian and or libertarian, right? And so he wound up drawing it as a sort of Cartesian plane, right? You've got the right over here, the left over here, authoritarianism and liberalism, and he says that fascism is far right but authoritarian. John, you are very smart. Upper left is authoritarian and left, and I believe that might have been communism, and then non-authoritarian, libertarian, and far left he classed as socialism. And it was an interesting sort of dissection of those pillars. But then when we have conversations related to like, hey, show me in American history, like what becomes a left agenda then? Like what is a left policy? And I said, is Obamacare a left policy? And he said, no, that's actually far off to the right. And I said, oh, Obamacare is far off to the right. And he was like, yeah. And so we had this interesting dialogue. And I had a problem grappling with that. And so for this conversation, I want to move away from right and left. I want to move away from authoritarian and libertarian, because I think that they're important distinctions, but I think that they're wholly philosophical, and you can't, it's very hard to pin down. And so I posted a video this morning that had, she's a professor. She was a PhD at Vanderbilt, and her name is Carol Swain. I wish I remembered what her subjects were at Vanderbilt. Articulate lady, very articulate. Posted this thing. It's for ProggerU, and so ProggerU is a conservative nonprofit organization. Like there's no hiding that fact or denying that or claiming that doesn't exist. Like it's a conservative organization, and it does YouTube videos that are meant to educate people. And so her position was basically like, hey, if you look at the history of the Democratic Party over the last 150 years, it started basically with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a slave owner. He was from the South. And so the Democratic Party was in favor of slavery, which is true. The Democratic Party led out of that. There's this interesting era for about 12 years after the Civil War, and I believe it's called the Reconstruction era. Feel free to fact check me on this. And so during that era, basically the South actually switched to political division, which I would question whether or not they actually fucking switched position, or it's just basically now slaves are able to assume a political position and have a fucking opinion, whatever. And so it's supposed to flip during that era over to the Republican side. In 1877, the North actually pulled out of the South, so they actually had almost like a martial law to help with this Reconstruction era. So they pulled out, and when they pulled out, then the political system actually switched again and moved over to being more democratic. And so you can look all this up. I'm not making it up; it's in the video. You can look it up however you want. 1877 is when they started moving into the Black Codes. The Black Codes, most people will know as the Jim Crow laws, which were incredibly segregatory. They were disgusting. And then you move into the 19th century, and there's so the 19th century is where it gets interesting, because the I don't even know if it's all media, just liberal media or some subset of media will tell you, hey, there was this great switch that happened in the sometime in the 20th century. And so some people will point to the, I think it's the New Era, 1935, and I think it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is all in this thread we were discussing, but if you pointed that at the Great Switch, there's this interesting dilemma in that when you move to the 1950s and 1960s, when there was civil rights acts happening, the Democratic Party was still anti-civil rights, and so they actually filibustered for, I think it's 125 or 127 hours. All this is in the video from ProgRU, and so it's interesting because now you can't claim that 1877 was actually when the switch happened. You can't claim that 1935 is when the switch happened. You can claim that 1964 is when the switch happened, which is basically JFK started doing the Civil Rights Bill, and then he got assassinated, which I want to say was by a Democrat. Might have to confirm that. It might be that Lincoln was killed by a Democrat. I don't remember. And then LBJ takes over. LBJ takes over the presidency. And he says this really shitty fucking quote, and you can see this in the video that I posted. And so then some people will say, well, then the Democratic Party switched in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And like, if you see his quote, it's like, hey, I'm going to have African American or black people voting for the Democratic Party for the next 200 years. And he uses the N-word, a derogatory sort of thing. And so my problem with all of this, right? Like it's a long rant and a long explanation and exclamation of all the information that happened within that thread. But my problem with this is, like, what's the single unifying principle of the Democratic Party, and what's the single unifying principle of the Republican Party? If you ask me for the Republican Party or for conservatism, I would say the idea is basically the 10th Amendment, right? Like, don't assume power that you don't need. Always push that down to a lower level of government, right? So the federal government shouldn't respond. This is the Board of Education and how, like, oh my God, this lady's saying that the federal government shouldn't do this stuff. Yeah, that's right. She's saying that the local government or the state government should be responsible for education, which I'm okay with. Like, I think that's reasonable and rational. The interesting spots where the Republican Party has stepped in over the last 150 years is basically where rights have not been extended to the entirety of the population, okay? And so this idea is basically like, we're not going to take power, or we're not going to assume power unless we absolutely have to. In the case of the women's suffrage, women weren't allowed the right to vote, and so the Republican Party was like, all people have the right to vote. And so, since you guys aren't able to pass that at the state level or fucking agree on it, we're going to take that over from a federal perspective, and we're going to add that as an amendment to the Constitution. And ta-da, they are granted the same rights afforded to every member or every person in American society. And that same sort of idea was then extended in the Civil Rights Act. So if you ask me, the conservative or the Republican perspective is very simply this: if we're going to pass a law, it needs to be good for everybody, or it's not a good law. And if it's not a good law, it simply might be that it's not a good law at the federal level, possibly handed down to the state level, and they decide that it's a good law, then they can pass it for their state. But that's not for the federal government to decide. Instead, they should do less and only take action when it seems that the states are incapable or come up with unconscionable decisions that infringe upon the rights that should be afforded to everyone. Okay, so women's suffrage, the right to vote, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. I should have actually pulled those up. But basically they said that, hey, all the rights that we've extended to people, you guys as states now have to abide by because they are in the Constitution. The Civil Rights Act is getting rid of Jim Crow. And so it's basically like, hey, these rights that we've extended to everybody pretty much extend to everybody. And so, and I might be biased because I'm at least fiscally conservative. But that seems to be the underlying premise for the last 150 years of the Republican Party is very simply that if we're going to afford a law at the federal level, it must apply to everybody and be unilaterally enforced across everybody. Otherwise, it's a piss poor law and just don't do it. Now, what can we say is the unifying premise of the Democratic Party over the last 150 years? And it's an open question. If you have a better supposition, position, or even reflection upon this, then I'd be happy to hear it. Until then, unfortunately, I'm going to go with my philosophy that seems to play out and align to the last 150 years of what exists of the Democratic Party. Now, you can say great switch, and I would say, does it really exist, or does this underlying premise extend past the 50-year mark or 50 years ago mark where we say that they got rid of this? And then basically the core premise that I would posit, or the single unifying premise that I would posit for the Democratic Party, is the redistribution of wealth. Redistribution of wealth. And that I think is okay at that level. If there's any like, holy shit, that's a crazy idea, go ahead and freak out and chat. But that's my core premise for my understanding that seems to align across the last 150 years of the Democratic Party. Okay, nobody's yelling at me yet. So what does that look like? A redistribution of wealth? Because at this point, you could take this two ways, and I want to be very clear that I politely misguided everyone, is that you could take a redistribution of wealth, and you could say that the redistribution of wealth, socialism, that's possible. Socialism, collectivism, this idea that we enable those that are unrepresented or lesser represented to be represented by a higher body, whether that's a union or a governmental body. I think that socialism is a very good supposition. I would question whether it's differentiated from redistribution of wealth, and here's why I posit that. So if you take this premise of redistribution of wealth, sounds very nice, right? If you're liberal or democratic currently, you would probably be like, well, redistribution of wealth means the people at the bottom should be elevated, and we should lean more towards the Scandinavian countries and their idea of, helping out the people at the bottom and social entitlement programs and et cetera and so on. Redistribution of wealth. And that's interesting, but the Scandinavian countries haven't actually done that well, and like realistically, their tax rate is something like 47%. You can keep me honest and fix my quote there, but basically, like their income tax rate is absurdly high because they're paying for these programs. The other things they found is basically that the redistribution of wealth and these social programs that they have really didn't fix the gender pay gap or the the gender gap in the way that people are now egalitarian across the board and everyone's equally represented in all job markets. Instead, they actually went and aligned more to what you would expect from a social psychology perspective, in that women tend to focus on jobs and careers that are more focused on people and interactions, and then men go for attainment. I think this is the right description of the things. There's science based on it. Jordan Peterson talks about it a lot. The Google fellow talked about it a lot. It's fascinating stuff. It really is. I don't want to get so much into the gender stuff, the Scandinavian countries, but I do want to say that I believe that the Democratic Party, the idea of redistribution of wealth, is a powerful supposition that you have within the party, whether or not that's this idea of giving rights down to the working class. Thanks, John. Or it's just this idea that you continue to elevate those who make the least, and such you grow the system. I wouldn't say that the redistribution of wealth is necessarily the wrong description of the party's action over the last 150 years, but I would question whether or not we categorized it accurately. And basically what I mean by that is, if you look at that last 150 years, and especially at civil rights era, but the idea of redistribution of wealth from the Democratic Party doesn't seem to be the redistribution of wealth for the people that are at the bottom of the working class. Like, it's not necessarily socialism and the individual workers wind up assuming more and more of the community. Instead, basically what it is you either cause inflation or you grow the number of people that are in the underprivileged class, such that they then revolt against the people who are a little bit above them. And then, of course, the redistribution of wealth doesn't actually go to that class, because inflation negates any gain they had. Instead, it winds up going to the bourgeoisie or the people at the top. And so I'm going to have to move away from federal law for a second and just focus on Seattle, because unfortunately that's the one I know a little bit more about some of the laws that have passed recently. And so you have things like the $15 minimum wage, and the $15 minimum wage sounds really good. But if you go to the Soviet Union, if you go to I think it's the USSR, it's Lenin, Stalin, 1920s, the Gulag Archipelago, etc. And basically what happened in Ukraine was they had a level of workers, and then there was the revolution, and out of the revolution there were a number of people, and I think they were called the Kolchaks. I'd have to look this up. Jordan Peterson talks about it regularly. If you're very interested, you can watch his stuff. Basically what they said is that the way to dismantle the system was the Germans came in and they said, hey, these people that are now in charge of you, these people that now own small plots of land that you're now working for, they stole that from you. And because they stole that from you, you have the right to go rape, murder, kill them, take all that they own, etc. And this wound up sort of killing the agrarian class of Ukraine, which caused tens of millions of deaths from starvation. And so this same idea applies in that you're taking and you're basically saying, hey, this lower socioeconomic status should feel aggravated or at war with the people who are one level above them, and thus should go seize what they have, and then that should continue to eat itself until there is no poverty. Basically, everyone's at the same level except for those that are the leading class or the bourgeoisie, which wind up being the ruling party, the tyrannical government, so on and so forth. And you can see this happen throughout the 20th century when you talk about communism and you talk about socialism. Like, all of those wind up boiling up to the same premise of the governmental body cedes all power and then removes all money and power from the lower classes, and then winds up killing anybody who dissents or disagrees with their position. In Ukraine, like, if you picked up grains of rice off a field that had been plowed, you could be shot in the back of the head for stealing food from the government if you didn't turn that in, if instead you decided to feed your starving family. And so This idea is frightening, but it's very much a redistribution of wealth. And so if you look at the last 150 years, you could say, well, slavery was a redistribution of wealth. It was the people at the bottom got absolutely nothing, absolutely, and instead it went to the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, the Democratic Party at the time. And so the idea wasn't that everyone gets this reward. Instead, the idea is that it coalesces at the top, and those at the bottom either don't deserve it or are responsible for the position that they're in. And so you extend that forward until whatever time frame or area you really want. If you talk about social programs in Seattle, the $15 minimum wage, basically what it said is one, we're going to drastically inflate the cost of living in Seattle, which is terrible. And you can see this in housing prices that have skyrocketed over the last 5 to 7 years. I'm sure you can draw this on a graph and it'll be nightmarish. And so they did this $15 minimum wage, which sounds very good. You can very easily sell that to somebody who's not making that much money. But when you look at it from an economic perspective, basically all that does is drive inflation. And then people who are living based on social entitlements now get, it's not that they get less, it's that their dollars actually function less. And the middle class that has been working and getting, 60 to, I don't even know what the middle class definition is anymore. I assume it's about 60,000 to 120,000. Their buying power actually decreases substantially. And all of a sudden Seattle is this emerald city where only the billionaires can live and actually afford to buy houses. And so a number of liberal friends on Facebook posted this meme that said, you now have to make $30 an hour in order to afford a 2-bedroom household in King County and one of the county, it was either Pierce, which I think it was, I don't know, somewhere close. So King County, at least, almost $30 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. And where do you think that increase comes from? Well, it comes from programs like social entitlements and probably from like ST3, where we drastically increased property taxes and we drastically increased the cost of tabs on cars. And if you look at ST2 and the amount of money that they reclaimed through fares, it's like 40% of their operating costs. 40%, like 2 out of 5, 40% of their operating costs comes from fares. The rest is from your taxes. That means that's a piss poor business, miserable business that can't sustain itself without taxes. And it's like, math is hard. I understand that math is hard. Totally get it. But when you look at that, is it a redistribution of wealth? And I would posit that, yeah, kind of it is, because the people that can't afford it now have to move further out and actually afford less of a standard of living than the people who live in the city. And the people who live in the city are, of course, those people who possibly wind up profiting the most off of this redistribution of wealth idea and this change in all the entitlements and so forth. Like basically, if you're a huge industrial business and you're able to afford these things, congratulations, you can now be in downtown Seattle. If you're a mom and pop business and you have a single fucking entity, a single store, a single enterprise, and you were planning on living there or sustaining there, and now you have to pay, I don't know what it is, 7 cents per liter, 50 cents per can of soda, something, for sugar tax. And if anyone owns a gun and somehow their house gets broken into, because we think that somehow people who own guns, let's get into that next. This idea that we're going to take from people and cause the government to impose huge financial penalties on people who are unable to protect themselves and protect our guns winds up hitting the communities that can least afford it absolutely the most. And I don't know how anyone can disagree with that or deny that or even fucking argue that realistically. Like, please do. I would love to have that conversation. But so when you talk about Seattle fiscal policy and you talk about Seattle law, it's all Democratic. Like, they've been Democratic for at least as long as I've lived here, which is the last decade. And yet the cost of living has fucking skyrocketed. The cost of owning property has skyrocketed. The taxes have skyrocketed. And everyone wants to say, oh, well, we need more entitlement programs and we need a higher minimum wage to afford this. No, we need to fucking stop passing stupid laws. But the redistribution of wealth in that case is not a redistribution across the entirety of society. Instead, it's a small distribution to the number of people who are suffering the most, which is almost enough to say, hey, you should vote for me, and a higher distribution that goes to the people who can afford it the most and actually make the most money. And so the redistribution of wealth, as far as I can posit over the last 150 years, seems to be the theme that you take from the people that can afford it reasonably, you promise it to the people that can afford it the least, and then you assign it from a governmental perspective to the people who have the most at their beck and call, the people that are best able to either legislate or to facilitate the conversation, lobby for laws that then provide the most for them. And so I think that if you take that as a core premise of there should be a redistribution of wealth, and the government should be the enabler of that redistribution of wealth. And that's a theme that you can extend over the last 150 years of the Democratic Party, and it's consistent. And if you can provide me a law that's different, I would love to look at it and have the discussion of why that doesn't afford best for the people at the top. I hope that's the case. I really fucking hope that's the case. But over the last 150 years, as far as I've seen, I haven't seen that to be the case. And so if you create a theme for the two parties of the political system in the US, it seems that the Democratic Party is a redistribution of wealth that often aligns itself to the top, which you could argue is a Pareto distribution and all this crap. Or you could say the Republican Party, which is like the government should cede less power and leave more up to the states and the local jurisdictions, because it's important to having a free and open, not only republic, constitutional republic, democracy, etc., but also a free economical system. And I think that's where I understand or can find a unifying premise for the American political system. And I get that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 1860s, it moved from the Whig Party into the Republican Party, or there's something. I get that. In the 1960s, people would say that, I'm going to forget his name. Something weird. Thurmod. I don't know. He was a Democrat, and then he went to a Dixiecrat, and then he went to a Republican, and that's part of how they express that the great switch has happened. And I understand those premises, but I also understand that it doesn't seem to explain the consistency of a theme across that time period. Further, I would say that the change in the 1960s is interesting, but it's not. It's basically based on one man that went from Democrat to Dixiecrat and into Republican. And there's some conjecture that there was basically some of the suppositions is that in the 1930s, when the South moved from Republican to Democrat, that was a shift in the party, and thus a switch in the party. And while the region may have representatively changed its position, I don't believe that's a change in the core platform. There, in the other thread, there's this idea of political planks instead of political platforms. Like you're changing out boards within a platform in order to realign the strategy of that given political party, and that's fascinating. But functionally, that's kind of hard to pin down. It's adding so much complexity that you can't simply explain what the core premise of the platform is. And if you can't articulate what that strategy is, that unifying strategy over whatever time period, whether that's 50, 100, 150 years, then I would guess that either you have no idea or the party has no idea. And if the party has no idea, then the party doesn't really exist. It's just a title or nomenclature. It's another position I'd be happy to discuss or look at. And so I think that's the summary of things I would like to leave you with today. Basically, we started with the Bill of Rights and how the Bill of Rights is a series of concentric rings that starts with your most important and most essential freedom, which is your freedom of belief, expression, and assembly. Like, you can say what you believe, you can believe what you believe, and you can align yourself to other people that believe that thing, whether that's news, religion, etc. Like, that's yours to have, keep, express, and own. That's First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment is you have the ability to protect that right, and thus you need to own, or you have the potential to own firearms to protect that right against tyranny, government, or local, wherever that might exist. The Third Amendment right is basically like your household is yours to own. You don't have to quarter soldiers. They can't come in time of peace or war and take over your house. Fourth through Seventh Amendment is basically like, hey, there is no jeopardy. You don't have to incriminate yourself. You have the right to a speedy, public, and fair trial. $20, like, you argue it once. If you win $20, you win $20 in civilian court. And then the Eighth Amendment right is excessive bail is unjust. And so, like, cruel and unusual punishment, excessive bail shall not be imposed. Like, those are ridiculous. Ninth and 10th Amendment right are basically like, hey, the Constitution should not deny or disparage any other rights that you have as a person. And then the 10th Amendment right is that those delegated by the Constitution and to the federal government shall not be exclusive to the federal government. Basically, they should land at the state and local government, if at all possible, because it's unjust or knowingly tyrannical to lead towards the oh, hi, special guest.
Yvonne.
Oh, who's that?
I don't know any of those people except Carrie. I only know Carrie. Hi, Carrie.
And Omar and Dan.
It's us.
John was on earlier. Craig.
It's us.
Hi, Craig.
It's us.
Okay, bye.
It's us.
So yeah, the Bill of Rights is basically concentric rings that build up your set of rights that you retain under the Constitution of the United States as your rights as an individual within the United States. And then, of course, my understanding or my supposition, my position or hypothesis related to Democratic and Republican parties in the United States history. And I'm not saying those are absolutely right. I'm saying they're my understanding or my thesis on how that explains the last 150 years of the political alignment that's happened within the United States. And it seems to hold true as far as I've been able to see, understand, or be acclimated to. So it's not absolute truth. It's my understanding of it. Happy to have that discussion, to discourse over it, to be disproven or have some other thing. But I don't know where that's at. There's this, let me see if I can open this up. There was this fascinating post that somebody I went to high school with shared, and it was a meme of Socrates, and it made me giggle a little bit. So let me see if I can pull it up. So Socrates, it quotes Socrates, and it says, when debate is lost, slander becomes the tool of the losers. And so basically that's like, hey, if you can't win an argument by the merits of the argument, then often you wind up in ad hominem attacks or attacking the person on either their credibility, their intelligence, or their understanding of a complex situation. And I wind up finding that becomes a truism that exists over a lot of the conversations that I have. If you think I'm a fucking idiot, then that's your belief to have. If you can disprove me on merit of facts, history, whatever, happy to have that conversation, would love to have that conversation. But if, like, all you're bringing to the thing is, oh, you're stupid because you don't know things, or you didn't learn in high school, then I don't know what to tell you, man. I really don't. Like, that's not even a rational argument, and Socrates apparently believes the same to be true. And so that's what I'll leave you with. That's Ready, Set, Engage, episode 16, Bill of Rights, my understanding of the political parties in the U.S., and I guess I didn't even tell you how to fix them. Maybe that'll be a topic for the next conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. I don't know how to click this off.